Pulaski, the birthplace of the KKK, had, I think, 100 people turn out for a No Kings rally there. I mean, folks have got to get out and energize one another. It's a really exciting time, and I believe that there's no pathway to change that doesn't run right through the South.
Hey there, I'm Jesse Mayshark, and this is Headlights, Voices from the Progressive South. Headlights is a production of the Progressive South, a nonprofit media platform dedicated to amplifying progressive voices and values across the southern United States. Voices like Nathan Higdon, who you heard up there at the top. Nathan is one of three guys here in East Tennessee who are producing a podcast called Cast Iron Resistance. And this week, we're doing something a little bit different with this episode because I sat in with them on one of their recordings a few weeks ago, and it was a really good conversation. We talked about politics here in the South, kind of the place of progressives within the broader South, the impact of both our local media, the national media, the right-wing media in particular, and some of the effects that we're seeing here locally from everything going on at the national level, and certainly the Trump administration. And so I want to play some excerpts from that conversation because it was a really good and lively conversation. These are really interesting, dedicated guys who I've known here for a while, and just thought that it might be fun for y'all to hear some of what we talked about. Before we get to that, I have one of the cast iron resistors here with me, Steve Wildsmith. Steve, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for asking me, Jesse. I'm going to add that to my resume, cast iron resistor. I like that.
So, Steve, I've known, I think I probably first got to know you online in the way we do these days.
Yes.
And Steve is a longtime journalist, a communications professional, a great arts and culture writer, and just a great writer and storyteller about the lives of people here in East Tennessee and across southern Appalachia and some of the struggles that people face here. So, Steve, before we talk about the podcast you all are doing, can you just tell us a little bit more about yourself? Where are you from? What is the path that you've taken to get to where you are?
Absolutely. Thank you, Jesse. I was born in Knoxville. I grew up in the Powell community, right north of Knoxville. But, my southern bona fides go back through, both parental lines. My dad's people are all from Alabama. My mom's people are all from Mississippi. So it wasn't until I got older that I really started to appreciate that connection to the South, and began to see too that, the South is such a multicultural place, and that taking Southern pride doesn't mean flying a Confederate flag. So, I'd going back through our family history, a lot of my mom's family fought for the Confederacy, and that's not exactly something I champion or that I'm proud of. But the fact is that I appreciate how people in the family have sort of progressed and evolved from those backward ways of thinking. So, and those kinds of things have always fascinated me as a writer, as a storyteller. I appreciate the journeys of regular folks. I am convinced everybody has a story to tell, regardless of what your station is in life or what your employment is. And I enjoy telling people stories. I was a writer for the Daily Times newspaper here in Maryville for years, and before that, kicked around Middle Tennessee and South Carolina. I'm also a recovering addict in long-term recovery, so that's been something that I've been very passionate about writing about. And just being able to tell those stories is, well, not to sound too cliche, Jesse, but it's a blessing, man, because most of the time, I tell people all the time, As a adjunct faculty member at a local college, I teach a journalism course, and as a longtime music writer, the students ask, who's the most famous person you interviewed, and they always lose their minds when I say, well, I once interviewed Taylor Swift. Of course, she was 15 at the time, and opening up for Tim McGraw and Rodney Atkins, so wasn't at the height of her fame by any means, but even then, the most enjoyable stories, the ones that meant the most, were the musicians who were playing down at the Pilot Light or over here at Bracken's Blues Club, who, don't have any big aspirations toward national stardom or fame, but just do it because they love it. And they're so amazingly talented. We were just talking before we started about the wealth of talent in East Tennessee. So just being able to lift up everyday people has been something that has always been a passion of mine. And especially these days when it seems like a lot of the more progressive voices are getting lost and drowned out in a sea of red noise.
Mm-hmm. So how did that bring you to Cast Iron Resistance? And tell us about your other two partners in it, because we are going to be hearing both of them in the upcoming clips.
Absolutely, yeah. So I've always been in addition to being a music writer, I was a columnist for the Daily Times. Made no bones about my progressive leanings. Was kind of the token liberal on staff, if you want to. Well, there were certainly others, but I was one of the ones putting it out there and writing about it. And what I found during that time is that most people, of course, you've got your diehards on both sides, but most people, when they sit down and have an actual conversation, realize that we have far more in common than we do different. And those are the areas that we need to focus on. And at the same time, for those of us on the left, we need a sense of camaraderie. The idea that, you're not this tiny dot floating in a big red ocean. There are more of us than we realize, and that together we can effect change if we put forth the effort. So that's always been kind of an idea, but it was my two comrades, Nathan Higdon, who was the vice chair of the Tennessee Democratic Party and a Blount County guy, went to high school around here, been in Blount County all his life, and Jeremy LaDuke, who is a local marketing and internet expert. They approached me, I guess it was about 4 or 5 months ago, and said, hey, we've got an idea for a podcast. We need a voice. We need a writer. Would you be interested? And I was like, well, how much do I have to do? Because as a family man and, a working professional, I'm pretty busy, but they told me the concept of it. And, those guys are, Nathan has the connections and Jeremy has the technical know-how, and so they said, well, let's do it together. And man, it's been great. I've really, really enjoyed it. We're not huge by any means, but we're certainly getting things out there and talking about, the fact that there is a movement afoot in the South in which progressives can have a role that actually makes a difference. Because I feel like that's what so many of us just sort of shrug our shoulders in despair, is thinking that we're living in a state with a conservative supermajority in the state legislature. There's no way we're going to get anything done or do anything. But then I see folks like the Justins, like Gloria Johnson, even though Gloria lost to Marsha Blackburn, she's still out there. Even though the Justins were expelled from the state legislature, they made their way back, and they are still holding feet to fire. And I think that's important. I think that's necessary, and I think other progressives can take up from that example.
And in one of your episodes, you talked to State Representative Afton Ben, who correct me on that pronunciation. Is it Ben? Is it Bain?
It's Bain.
Bain.
Mm-hmm.
Afton Bain, who right. Actually is from here in East Tennessee, grew up around Knoxville, and now lives in Nashville and is a state representative there, and is one of the sort of, I guess, shining young progressive voices in the state. And I guess, in talking to her and in talking to people like that, what do you take away from that yourself?
I think that the biggest thing is just encouragement and not giving up, because these individuals, obviously being a young progressive in a state legislature filled with old conservative white guys, and it can be daunting, but she has been a rabble rouser, for lack of a better term, for a long time. And there's some great pictures of her being dragged out of Bill Lee's office back during the protest. I cannot remember the name of the legislator who was accused of sexual misconduct. And there was a big.
There's been a lot of.
There's been a lot of them, yeah. But anyway, there was a protest seeking his removal from the legislature, and she's being dragged out of Governor Bill Lee's office. And it's one of those things that she's refused to back down. She speaks up for what is right. She seeks out ways to make her voice heard, even though it may not, result in any passage of laws or anything like that. She's still sending up the flares that other progressives can look to and go, hey, that's one of ours. And I think that's the most important thing, is just knowing and hearing that sort of encouragement that we're still here, all of us, and that we can band together and focus on the change that we can make in our local communities.
And you can find that episode with the interview with Representative Bain at Cast Iron Resistance, which you can find on all of your normal podcast outlets. And you can also there find the full version of the conversation that we had. But I'm going to just kind of excerpt some of the parts of that I think might travel the best outside of our own little realm here in East Tennessee. It was a great conversation, and we're going to go listen to that now. So, Steve, thanks so much for the invitation to join you all, and thanks for talking to me today.
Thank you for agreeing to be a part of it, Jesse. Thanks for the amazing conversation. It was a blast. I think that there are a lot of folks who are looking for something different. And I'm not saying they're looking for answers on the left. They are just sick and tired of what's going on out there. So, and one of the things that I kind of wanted to touch on, Jesse, is, and, Nathan, Jeremy, as always, you guys jump in, is, man, how in the hell does the media keep up with what is going on out there? I mean, we've all heard the term flood the zone, but as somebody who has spent a lot of time in newsrooms and has spent some time with arguably one of the best known papers in the world, how do journalists and reporters just stay on top of what's happening and do it justice in giving it some context to people?
Well, I mean, I think the first answer to that is arguably they don't do it very well, which is not to, there are a lot of good reporters all across America. There are great reporters at the New York Times. There are great reporters at CNN. Those places absolutely still have very talented people who I think are sincere in what they're trying to do. But at the same time, I think, like, we all know that we have been in a period of decline of what we call the mainstream media now for a couple of decades. Like, this is not a news story. It's just kind of one that continues to spiral downward in a lot of ways. And, that has various effects. One of the effects is that there just aren't as many people covering all of this. And that certainly has an impact at a place like the New York Times. But I think it has even more of an impact when you come down a level or two from there. And think about in Tennessee, what we have now is we basically have 4 major papers, more or less, in Tennessee, which are the papers in the 4 biggest cities. 3 of them are owned by Gannett, or what the company that calls itself Gannett now. This is not even the same Gannett that we had. Gannett was already a problem 10 years ago. Then Gannett got bought, by Gatehouse. And so now we have this sort of bastardized version of what was a not great media company to begin with. And they control, the 3 biggest papers in the state. And what that has allowed them to do through the mechanics of efficiency is they got rid of a whole bunch of reporters, especially reporters who covered state government. And so where, we used to have the News Sentinel, the Tennessean in Nashville, Commercial Appeal in Memphis, and the Chattanooga Times Free Press, they all had their own reporters in Nashville, covering state government, covering the governor, covering the legislature. And now the News Sentinel does not have any reporters in Nashville. The Commercial Appeal does not have any reporters in Nashville. There are like a couple of reporters from the Tennessean who are providing coverage to all, the three biggest cities in the state. And that same pattern is played out everywhere across the country. And so I think that, my answer is the media is not keeping up. And especially, of course, it's challenging with the Trump administration because, as you say, they're doing everything they can to just overwhelm people, overwhelm opposition, overwhelm the media, overwhelm just like your average citizen's ability to pay attention and take in what's going on. And then those same people, if they do want to try to understand not just what's going on in Washington, but like how does what's going on in Washington affect us here in East Tennessee? Like there are probably 200 stories that should have been written in the last couple of months that haven't been, and like I've done some stories. There are lots of reporters who have done some stories, but there's so much that we are still not hearing about in terms of the real direct impact on real people's lives. That it's a problem. And so, again, like I think having outlets of any kind and any size, whether it's one person with, a Substack or a couple of people with a podcast or whatever, like all of those are important. We can't fill the gaps, but, every bit helps.
I'm going to be the contrarian for a second. So I think the accountability and the transparency that reporting provides is in dire. We need that desperately. However, I think one of the big missing pieces right now is we've got so much information thrown at us that we can hardly digest and act on. Right now, I think one of the things that I feel, and I know other people feel it, is these things are coming at us 1,000 miles an hour. Like first it's, LA, now it's Iran. Now, what's it going to be next? It's just all these things. What do we, if we have that knowledge, what do we do with it? What is something actionable we can run with to prevent the next big thing?
And Jesse, I want to just tag team that and add on to, from your experiences, like as say one of the drivers, you and Scott behind Compass, like obviously, like you said, there are so many things you could write about. What is the litmus for, are we going to cover this? Are we going to go to this meeting? What are we going to provide to folks of all of the hundreds of things we could possibly be writing about right now? How do you determine that? And again, once you do and you present it, like Jeremy said, what should people do with that information?
Yeah, so I think that, in terms of what to cover from day to day, as like a lot of that is just driven by sort of like, what's the most important thing that's happening right now? And then sometimes you have days where there's not like that big obvious breaking news story and you have time to kind of take a breath and do something a little more big picture. But what I think and what we've always tried to do at Compass, and also honestly, like what I'm trying to do with Headlights and the Progressive South is not just kind of try to provide basic information about something that's going on, but provide the context that surrounds it. Because I think that more than anything, like it is the lack of basic reporting that is a problem. But beyond that, because all of these newspapers, in addition to getting rid of their reporters, they got rid of their editors. I mean, I know that here in Knoxville, the News Sentinel, they have almost no editors. And the editors they have almost no local background or grounding. When I worked at the News Sentinel 30 years ago, I was working for editors who had been at the paper and had been in Knoxville for decades. They knew everybody. They knew the backgrounds of stories and issues. Now a story pops up, and even if it gets covered by the local media, it's covered by somebody who's only been in town for 2 years, which is fine. There was a point where I had only been in town for 2 years, but there's nobody behind them saying, well, here's why this matters. Here's how it fits into what happened 3 years ago or 5 years ago. And so I think that And so to Jeremy's point about that flood of information, which is a real problem, and that's really hard for all of us to deal with, the people who I know I look for, like say if I'm trying to understand something about what's going on in the Middle East, are not just like whatever the New York Times story is on the breaking news of the day, but like who is that really knowledgeable writer? And these days, a lot of times it is somebody with like a Substack or something who can take what's going on, but like tell you what it means, because that's actually what's important. And that is the vital step then to understanding what do I do, at my local level? How is this going to affect me, or what are the ways that I can in some way engage with this? And I think that's again going back to like the people who I've been talking to on the Headlights podcast are almost all people who are doing things wherever they are. Some of them are elected officials. Some of them work for nonprofits. Some of them are writers and artists. I mean, I had Adeem the artist on to talk about their perspective on, being a queer country singer in the South. But they're all people who are active, who are doing things right now at their local levels where they are, because I think that's, like, if anything makes a difference, historically, if you look back at all of our various struggles over time, like it's been people at local levels and then coordinating with other people, and eventually you can get to state levels and national levels. But it's people who are active on the ground. And I think that's and encouraging people to look for ways to get active on the ground. And I mean, Nathan, I know this is something you all emphasized very much at like Knox Pride too, is that like it's really important for people to get active where they are. And if you're seeing something at the national level or the global level or whatever, it's overwhelming if you try to think how you can solve those problems, but there are places and ways to engage. And so I think that is one of the best things that any level of media can do is provide the context to people, telling them what this means and why it's happening, and then looking for those really granular ways to get engaged.
Absolutely.
And that's an interesting thing, like when you were mentioning that on this very local level, that's something I've been seeing as I've been traveling across the state. I think I just hit 33 counties that I've visited across the state since January. And that is something I'm seeing people engaged in communities that might have kind of a news desert, as it were. But I'm seeing people with getting information when and where they can. So oftentimes it's local online papers or through their, through Substack or community groups on Facebook, etc. But people mobilizing in small towns, to your point that Steve made on the No Kings rallies. I mean, Pulaski, the birthplace of the KKK, had, I think, 100 people turn out for a No Kings rally there. I mean, folks have got to get out and energize one another. It's a really exciting time, and I believe that there's no pathway to change that doesn't run right through the South.
Yeah, that's something that I have long told, and especially now, friends and family who live other places, that the South is where, like, everything that the Trump administration is trying to do, or most of what they're trying to do at the national level now, are things that we're already living with. That a lot of the things in the Project 2025 agenda have already been in our state legislatures. Like we are familiar with these fights, and I totally agree. Like, I think it has always been true about the United States that if you want the United States to reach its best representation of its ideals, you got to start in the South. Like, if you can do that in the South, you can do that across the country. But this has always been where the inequities have been the greatest, and where the use of power by specific groups of people to limit the rights of other people, like that's a through line through all of American history, and we're living with it again now. We still have people who live in Tennessee have in many ways fewer rights than people who live in many other parts of the country. I guess the major exception there is gun rights. And if that is a major issue for you, then it is true that you can move to most parts of the South and have basically all the gun rights you want. But when it comes to labor rights and reproductive rights and, sort of basic civil rights and racial justice, we still have big challenges here. And this is where you ought to be focusing if you really want to address all those things.
Absolutely. I think that was one of the driving forces behind these guys, their decision to launch this podcast was there's so many people out there who were, like Jeremy said, being flooded with information and just kind of walking around in a daze wanting to know what can I do about it? What can I do? And, so Nathan's experience organizing and like, as he pointed out, it's one of those things that there are ways to get involved, but people often need to be pointed in the right direction. And I feel like that is one of the things that the media can do well, and it doesn't have to be perceived as bias. However, I think a lot of folks, and not just in the South, but a lot of folks do see the media as biased. And it's funny because, just the other day, somebody was, it was an immigration argument on Facebook, and a friend of mine posted a CBS News poll, and somebody immediately said, "You need to get your news from better sources. Try Newsmax." And I'm just like, that's one of the things, and we could talk for a whole other hour about that, but how did we get to a point where so many people are divided over what accurate news is made of and where it comes from?
Uneducated people and confirmation bias. But yeah, Jesse, I'm sure, has a much better explanation.
Well, no, I think that's right. But see, the big picture of this to me, that I feel like in a weird way, everybody understands the importance of the role of right-wing media, of Fox News and Rush Limbaugh and talk radio and everything. Like, at some level, most people would say, right, yes, that is out there, and we know that influences people. But I think even now, like 30 years after the launch of Fox News, we underestimate the importance of that because that did not used to exist. So if you think about like the media environment of 1990, I think Rush Limbaugh had maybe just started then. He launched like in the late 80s, and he really kind of came to prominence during that George H.W. Bush term as a critic mostly of Bush from the right, as this like loudmouth on the radio who was constantly bashing the president. And so all of the entire universe of right-wing media that we know now has grown up from zero over the last 35 years. The New York Times was already there in 1990. CBS was already there in 1990. The New Yorker, like all of those other things, they were already there. What's new is this gigantic new self-contained ecosystem of information that as it has grown, we now have a couple of generations of Americans, depending on what household they grew up in and what they've kind of gravitated toward politically, have kind of grown up inside. I think of it as, we use words like bubble, but this is more like, it's really like a sealed system, the right-wing media system. Because the first thing that they did in creating it was to tell the people who they were bringing in, only listen to us. Don't listen to anybody else. You cannot listen to the New York Times because they're biased. CBS is and so we have, I really started to see this change in talking to local politicians sometime in the early 2000s, where by that point, the right-wing media was big enough and had been around long enough that you started to realize, there are people I'm talking to who are literally only getting their information from Fox and then all of the other things that spun off of that. And then, of course, once the internet comes along, there's been the explosion of Breitbart and all of the other avenues that are out there. And they're not all identical, but they are all operating out of sort of a particular ideological view of the world, they do almost no reporting at all. Like there's very little original reporting on the right. What they do is they absorb the actual reporting that gets done by places like the New York Times, and then they feed it through their own filters and chop it up the way they want to present it, and they serve it up to their audience. And that creates a real problem for people who are not part of that ideological worldview. I also think it creates a problem for the people who absorb it, because a lot of what they're being told is like just fundamentally false. Like a lot of the day-to-day chaff of like the right-wing outrage machine, it's like there's so much of it that's just nonsense. It's just like stuff that's thrown up to get people mad and make them one more way, here's another way that the liberals are destroying America, And so that, I think, is actually, like, people can talk about the failings of the mainstream media, and I have worked in the mainstream media, and I have lots of opinions about the failings of it. It has lots of very real failings. But that's not really what's gone on. What's really gone on is you have now like a third, 30 to 40% of the country that lives inside an impermeable information bubble that tells them that that any information from outside that bubble is untrustworthy, and therefore, you have to only listen to what's inside it. And I think the problem for liberals with this is liberals do not pay attention to the right-wing media at all. Like I always have, because I think it's interesting. But liberals have no idea what world of information a lot of the country is living inside of. And that's why, like, Trump, even in his first term, would come out and say these things that sounded sort of crazy to, your average person who was not from that universe, because all of their reference points are these weird things that was like a scandal on Fox News 2 years ago. You only know those references if you live inside that village. So that, I think that's the biggest challenge. And I also think that the mainstream media is totally incapable of actually dealing with that set of facts. And so what has tended to happen is that the right-wing media spins up some big outrage over something. Transgender people have been a major focus and victim of this over the last, several years. And so all the people in right-wing world get all worked up about this and are all screaming and yelling about it. Next thing you know, you've got, because there's a direct pipeline from the right-wing media to right-wing legislatures, you've got people in your state legislature suddenly writing these bills. That's when the mainstream media will pay attention and be like, oh, what's going on here? Oh, this legislator is, proposing this bill. Why are they proposing it? They might talk to them. Maybe they'll talk to an advocate on the other side and kind of present it as. But what they don't understand is that is a victory itself of the right-wing media, because they have created this thing. They've pushed it out into the world. There's now going to be legislation over it, and the mainstream media is now compelled to talk about it somewhat using the framing that came out of the right-wing media. And that has just happened on issue after issue. It's happened on climate. It's happened on all sorts of different things. And it creates a really, I think, destructive chain of information, because, again, most of what's being pushed out is at best, talk about being biased. It's insane that we talk about media bias as a problem of the New York Times when 30 to 40% of the country is getting their information from Fox and Newsmax. That then runs into the problem with the media where, again, we just don't have enough reporters. The reporters we do have don't know enough. They don't have enough experience. Maintaining a solid media core that is able to withstand all of that, it's going to be challenging.
Indeed.
You definitely can see like how he's rushed in this just lack of decency. One of the examples that stands out in my mind is Burchett. He almost wears as a badge of honor, like, quote unquote, owning people who are trying to ask him questions on his Twitter and videos of him kind of slamming them. It's just like, how did we get to this point?
Yeah, and I know Burchett well, and it's interesting to me to watch that, because I feel like a lot of that was always there with him. He's always been a guy with pretty big chip on his shoulder. He has a lot of, I'm going to do armchair psychology on him, but he has a lot of insecurities. he's a guy who thinks that other people have always thought that he was dumb. Other people have always thought they were smarter than him. He probably has run into that a lot. Anyway, that's a very deep-seated thing with Burchett. In some ways, I think it's one of the more genuinely Appalachian things about him, because I do think there can be very much a sort of Appalachian chip on the shoulder about being disrespected, about people thinking you're dumb, and not without reason. There's been a lot of very, negative stereotypes about people from Southern Appalachia over the years. And so I think that that's a real thing that Burchett carries. But he kind of kept it, when he was county mayor and in the state legislature, you would see that side of him occasionally, but he mostly kind of kept it tamped down, and because he can be very personable. He's a great retail politician. I always tell everybody he's the most natural politician I've ever seen in terms of being able to walk into a room, shake people's hands, say, "Hey, girl, how you doing?" He's just like, he loves people. He loves attention. But like a lot of Republicans, I think he has found his worst instincts being not just liberated, but in a way validated and catered to by the Trump era. And yeah, he has leaned into it hard. And, I know some people who say, well, he's just not the Burchett that I knew. And I think, well, I don't know. I mean, people don't change that much. Because there are other Republican members of Congress who are not doing what Burchett's doing. They all could be if they wanted to, but they're not. I think a lot of it is who he is. But yeah, the constraints have been taken off. The funny thing that I always tell people about Burchett is that I had many interactions with him because I worked for the city of Knoxville while he was Knox County mayor. So we were at a lot of events together. We also shared a bathroom. There's a men's room on the 6th floor that Burchett would come down to use, and it was the one that I used because it was closest to my office. And he had his own bathroom in his office, but he would. There were certain acts that he would not perform in that bathroom because he then didn't want to open the door and have odors coming out of it that he thought would. He didn't want to trouble the woman who worked at his desk. He was being polite, so he'd go down the hallway to use the toilet. And he would walk into the bath. That guy loved talking on the toilet. He would walk into the bathroom, and if there was somebody in the stall, like, say, me in one of the stalls, he'd be like, "Hey, who's in here?" And you kind of like identify yourself and say, "Hey, Mr. Mayor, hey, how's it going?" And then he'd like come into the stall next to you and sit down, and he would start a conversation. He took phone calls in the bathroom. You'd walk in there, and he'd be in the stall, and he'd be on the phone talking to somebody. Or you'd walk in the bathroom and he would just be playing classic country music on his phone, and he'd call him like, "I just like a little bit of music while I'm in here." I mean, like, he is in many ways like a quirky and kind of funny guy, and more than a bit of an oddball. But then, yeah, he also has this like very mean. He's got a mean streak. He really does, and he is totally letting it fly, probably in the bathroom as well as other places.
Was there a particular
bathroom story? Just because
That's
it's
awesome.
This was my experience for years.
They made the whole podcast worth it right there.
Yeah, it's a classic moment right there. Is there a particular country song that goes through your head whenever you tell that story?
No, I don't remember what it was. It was, he only liked the classic stuff. So, it was probably like Waylon Jennings or Buck Owens or something. Yeah. And that wraps us up for this week. Remember, the Progressive South is a nonprofit media outlet, and you can find information about contributing to our efforts on our website, theprogressivesouth.org. If you do feel moved to make a donation, first of all, thank you. And second, make sure you make a note in the comments accompanying it that it is for the Progressive South. Thanks to Bark for our theme music, and to Lord Seth the Libertarian for his production work at Barbarian Productions. And thanks to you for listening. Remember, you can call and say hey from wherever you are. Just leave us a message at 865-214-7764. That's 865-214-PROG. Tell us your first name, where you're calling from, and take up to a minute to let us know what's going on where you are. We'll talk to you soon.